Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Wigtown Wednesdays. My name's Stuart Kelly, and it's a real pleasure to be here with Natalie Haynes to discuss A Thousand Ships, her reworking of the reworking of the reworking of the Iliad. It's an astonishing book. It tells the story of the Trojan War from a female perspective. I thought it was just wonderful. You can see the number of pages I've folded down.
Stuart.
Natalie and I judged the Booker Prize together. I've known her for some time, and there's always a little bit of fear you have when somebody whom you like has written a book, and you think, I really just hope it's good. It really, really is. I was astonished by it. So, Natalie, to begin with, and we'll try and leave about half an hour for questions from the audience, and thank you all so much for joining us. Why did you want to retell this ancient myth through the perspectives of the women involved?
I suppose the short answer is I'm not sure I could think of another women's epic. I had myself told a couple of tragedies from the perspectives of women. I did it with The Amber Fury, which is a retelling of the Oresteia set in contemporary Edinburgh. And I did it with The Children of Jocasta, which is a retelling of the Oedipus story from the perspectives of two women. But that's still just one family, one quite close-knit family, we might say. But the Trojan War, the sort of huge war narrative, I felt like nobody had... I was walking home back to my flat in London, and I came out of the park, and as I was walking along the road past the running track, I thought, I would really like to tell this story. I want to do the Trojan War for a long time, but I'd really like to do it in a kind of quite expansive way. And what I'd really like to do is be able to do like the Greeks and the Trojans. And then I was like, so would I have one Trojan voice, one Greek voice? I'm like, no, I'd like to do kind of all of them. I'd like to do the goddesses, the mortals, the Greeks. I'd like to do I want to write an epic. And all the way home, I was thinking, someone must have done this. And I got back and I was kind of frantically Googling. I'm like, is it mine? Can I have this? Is this my idea? Can I? And I was just like, but really, can I? And then I sold it to my publishers with Jocasta, which I'd already written. And they said, can you give us a page on your idea for another novel? And then we'll see. And I wrote basically, I said, I'm going to tell the story of the Trojan War. I'm going to start with the horse, because that's the bit everybody knows. And then I'm going to do a causation timeline that runs backwards and a consequences timeline that runs forwards. And it's going to flip from perspective each chapter. So it'll be Greeks and Trojans, gods, mortals, and it'll be fun. And they went, okay. And, luckily, I thought they would find it more troubling than they did. I didn't realize there would be a kind of present tense storyline in it, which is basically the Euripides play, The Trojan Women.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to, almost every stage, the causes of the Trojan War are goddesses. And they're that I find them really interesting, writing these women, or writing these female characters at least, who are just monstrous and don't care. And have, there are no consequences for anything that they decide, at least for themselves. So I really wanted to write those kinds of characters who would be funny and heartless and vicious and scheming. They're basically malevolent toddlers who don't die. And at the same time, it's a war that ravages the lives of everyone around it. And we're so used to knowing the story from the Iliad, I guess. But it's not even 2 months in the final year of the war, so it doesn't tell us any of the causes. That was in a poem called the Kypria, long lost, and now only a few fragments remain. And we don't have any of the aftermath. The bit that we know the best, in fact, the two bits that linguistically you might suggest we know the best, the Trojan horse and Achilles' heel, don't appear in the Iliad. And I'm like, well, think of all the women's stories that don't appear in the Iliad. The story of Penthesilea, the Amazon warrior queen who comes to fight. The story, and I was like, these stories are just totally forgotten, outside of a kind of relatively small number of people who are lucky enough to study classics at school. And I thought this is a huge epic story, and I can't think. I'm still struggling, to be honest, now to think of epic stories told about women and about women's lives. It's almost always when you have the story of a a war or something like that, it might focus on very recently on kind of one woman or one woman's family, like the Hunger Games, but you're still really pushing it to find an epic narrative that focuses on women. And I thought, well, if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. This is a book I'd like to be able to read. Say again?
Handmaid's Tale?
Yeah, I guess it doesn't feel particularly like an epic. To me, it feels like a society, like a dystopian novel, rather than an epic. Because it doesn't.
Narrative, yes.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I love Handmaid's Tale. Don't get me wrong. I in no way throw shade over Margaret Atwood. And maybe now there's a sequel to it. Maybe it feels more like a saga, more like an epic in that regard. But at the time of reading Handmaid's Tale, which I must have read really close to the first time I read the Iliad, I don't remember feeling that I was reading a kind of Homeric type of narrative. Although obviously Atwood's Penelopead, which is a tiny, slender mini epic, and that kind of slides into the Odyssey as sort of book 25, is absolutely, it's just wonderful.
In terms of putting the women at the centre,
yes.
It was important that the opening, when the invocation to the muse is given, just as it is in the Iliad, it's pointed out that Homer is blind. He's blind to the stories that he doesn't actually see. Yeah,
it was a small bone of contention with my lovely publishers. We argued about very little, and I stood my ground on even less. But this was one of those things. So the first line of the Iliad famously is "Menen Iada Thea Peli Arjo Achilleus." I promise I don't know the whole Iliad by heart. I just know some of it and that bit. So rage, sing, goddess, son of Peleus, Achilles. So when I was at school, we used to have to write those essays explaining that the line is kind of occupied by Achilles, because his rage, Menen, is the first word, and his name, Achilleus, is the last word. And somehow we kind of forgot to notice that the first person mentioned in the entire poem is Thea, the goddess. And she isn't named, which to me was very important. And I think she is the same, almost everyone, I think, probably who studies it thinks the same. She is the same figure as the Musa, the muse, in the first line of the Odyssey. And it seems most reasonable that would be Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, because that's the territory we're in. You don't need the muse of, tragic poetry or dance at this stage. This is epic. And the fact that she's not named. Say again?
Well, I was just going to say, no terpsichore there. But,
it is, I know.
Goddess.
Yeah. It is goddess. And so I thought I wanted to borrow that first line and kind of make a play on it. So mine begins, "Sing muse," he says, and so on and so on. So she's quite shirty about him doing it. And my publisher, my editor, came back to me and said, "Look, I'm not sure everyone will realise that the blind poet is Homer, because the reason that we think Homer might have been blind is because the bard called Demodocus in the Odyssey is sometimes viewed by some people as a reference to Homer, and he is blind." And it's like, I wrote back and said, I'm sorry, I haven't made myself clear. I don't care if people know it's him or not, because it doesn't matter, because it's not about him, it's about her. And then the first line of the Iliad and the first line of the Odyssey, he cites her, asks her for her help, but doesn't name her. So I'm going to do the exact same thing in reverse, and that's how we will learn as people. And they kind of went, "Oh, okay." And I'm like, it doesn't, if you don't get that reference, it won't make any difference at all. He's just some guy who wants to write a poem, and she's the goddess. Our emphasis should all be on her. And I'm still sure I'm right here. I think if it said that it was Homer, if it was clearer that it was Homer, there would be a tendency to think, "Oh, well, Homer is going to get," it's like, no, we're done here. He's not important. And the same is true when Achilles dies. In my version, they kind of wrote back and said, it's like one page and he's dead. And you go, yeah, because it's not about him. It's about the women whose lives he's impacting on. And then, oh, okay. But it did take a while to persuade everyone that that wasn't weird. I still feel fine about it, though.
Tell me, in terms of the way you constructed the book, there are so many of the women, the Trojan women, Andromache, Polyxena, Hecuba, or Hecate. Why is Helen not really there?
Well, she's in the
given it
Trojan
is.
women's scenes, yeah.
She is on one scene, but 1,000 ships, and it's Marlowe's line.
Yeah.
Is this
Oh,
the
it is
base of
not. It's
1,000
Aeschylus'
ships?
line. Milo nicked it. Oh, don't you start me, Stuart Kelly. It's in Aeschylus and it's in Euripides. And the word in Greek is kilianaus, 1,000 ships. And then it's used again by Ovid in the Heroides, mille rates, 1,000 ships. Marlowe nicked that. Don't come with all your Marlowe to me. He's a newbie as far as I'm concerned. The man's an Arabist.
I did English and you did classics.
Mine came first. I wanted Helen to have. I wanted her to have her full story, and I wrote a draft where she did. And the version of Helen that we have in the Odyssey, the version that we have in the Iliad, is really, really interesting because she's extremely self-recriminating about the war. She blames herself really severely, more than Hector does, more than Priam does. And she blames Paris, but she really does take responsibility on it for herself. But in the Odyssey, we see the aftermath of the war when Telemachus, who's the son of Odysseus, is looking for his dad, and he goes to Sparta to see if they've heard anything about Odysseus, who's by now been gone for 9 years. 1 year of which, so we always think of the Odyssey as being a huge adventure story. He spends, of the 10 years it takes him to get home, fully 7 of them shacked up with a woman named Calypso, and another 1 shacked up with a woman named Circe. So, 8 years of those adventures were very much bedroom adventures, which I'm in favour of still, though. But in the Odyssey, Telemachus gets to Sparta, and he goes to the palace of Menelaus and Helen, and he asks them about the war. And they start reminiscing, and Menelaus starts to cry when he remembers his comrades who fell in the war. And Helen doesn't say anything to anybody. She calls over a slave woman, and she has the slave woman bring her a bag of herbs, which she got from her friend Polydamna in Egypt. And Homer gives us nearly 10 lines on these herbs. He calls them nepenthes, grief banishing. And he explains that if you took a potion with these herbs in it and you saw your parents die, you'd be fine. If you saw your child cut down with bronze, a spear, you wouldn't mind. So this is obviously a class A substance by anyone's standards, right? And Helen says nothing to anyone, puts it in the wine and just serves it up. And I tried really hard to write a version of her story where she's drugging Menelaus with rohypnol every night for the rest of their marriage. And I thought I just cut it through the whole book off balance. And so I took it out again. And I thought, do I really want to find a more boring version of Helen to put in? Do I want to, and I looked at it and I thought, this story is about the unsung women. That's the reason Calliope is so, jubilant at the end and so, aggro earlier on. It's like, this is the story of women whose stories have been lost. And Helen's story has never been lost. She's always been the most famous, for us anyway. If you ask this question in Greece, you get a different answer. But for us, she's probably the most famous person involved in the war. She's the only one we've appended the words of Troy to, for example. And so I thought, you know what? This is a product of its time and its culture. So I'm writing it for an English audience. We know who Helen is, and so she gets her moment, and she gets to have a fantastic. Well, I really liked writing it, a sort of face-off with Odysseus, and she's a sort of, in theory, a kind of broken woman of a broken city, standing on a shore in rags, and actually she just sort of pitches up looking magnificent, hits him with the full "I'm the daughter of Zeus" whammy, and then strides off into the sunset. And I thought, yeah, she's basically Clint Eastwood the way I've written her, and I'm completely fine with that.
Well, I mean, it is astonishing, and there's something important about her being not central compared to the others, because the whole point of the book, it seems to me, is all the other stories going round about, from Creusa,
yes,
right the way through to Perseus, who barely gets half a hexameter.
Well, she gets 14 lines, I can cheerfully tell you, in book 19 of the Iliad, and that's it. In the entire poem, the woman whose lack of agency causes the whole quarrel, she has 14 lines in book 19, and I know because I went through and I counted them. So, yeah, she is an unsung heroine. She needed to have her turn, and I suppose I felt, I mean, there's another very hidden reference in not having more of Helen, which is that there is a counter narrative of Helen which is almost entirely lost to us now, where she doesn't go to Troy, she goes to Egypt. And the gods
she's a phantom.
An eidolon, an image of her that looks like her, but it's made of air. And at the end of the war, and this dates back as far as Homer, it dates back to the 8th century BCE, at the end of the war, the Greeks get their hands on her. The war is fought in exactly the same way, except it's not her. At the end of the war, they get their hands on her, and she disappears into the air that she was made of. It's like the most perfect metaphor for the futility of war. And I thought, in a way, there is something really gratifying. I thought, at least, at best, maybe 3 people will ever notice I've done this. And I feel all right about that. Is that Helen in my book has that kind of quality, that she's there but not there. And I thought, well, that's really satisfying for me. But I do see it as like a little, what is it they call it in gaming? An Easter egg. It's like an Easter egg for the people who are paying attention.
For those who are paying attention, one thing about the book which is absolutely clear is, although it's about an ancient myth, there are very, very contemporary themes coming through in it. You have the abjection of women, you have them being basically sex trafficked, you have refugees, you have a war waged for no perceptible reason.
Yes.
How important was it to you to write the book in which it would have those chimes and resonances towards the present?
I wish that it was possible to write a book about war any other way, but it's not, I don't think. And so when you start looking at the stories, like when people ask questions about why Greek myth is still relevant, it's like, I would love there not to be trafficked women, but there are. It would be great if we stopped having wars. That would be I would absolutely write about something different if that happens. Hasn't happened yet though, so I'll probably keep writing about war. So I think you know this already because we've discussed it before, I think every telling of a myth has a minimum of 2 and usually many more timelines working within it. So the book is set in the Bronze Age and it operates in the Bronze Age. You know, people don't have mobile phones or, suddenly possess things that couldn't exist for another 1,000 years, or not very often anyway. But it also has the sensibility of now because it's being written as a novel for an audience in the 21st century in a world where we finally started, I think, to hear women speak. And so as I was writing it, the Harvey Weinstein stories were breaking, and it was really incredible. And also the Bill Cosby story. Remember when the New York Times ran that headline which said, he said, she said, she said, she said, she said, she said, she, and it was just dozens of women's names. And it's like, this is how much we're saying a woman's story is worth. It's like a 47th of what his story was worth as a powerful man. And I thought, as I was writing, it's like, I would really like it not to be relevant. I would like the world to be better. But given that the world is as it is, it made me think of that line at the beginning of Thucydides, where he says he's writing his history as a possession for all time, because human nature being what it is, it'll always be relevant. And I thought, well, yeah, would that it weren't so, but it is.
Your Agamemnon is very much a kind of Harvey Weinstein figure.
I absolutely can't stand it, Stuart. Killing him was the happiest day of writing I've ever done. I write on a laptop, which you can currently see. But I promise you, on the days when I killed Agamemnon, spoiler, I wrote like this. I was just overjoyed. I could have done it twice. I just loved it.
And indeed, Clytemnestra says, I wish I could have killed them twice.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm
one
right
of
there
the
with it.
great points of the book. Can we talk about one of the other men in the book who is centre stage, and that's that complicated man Odysseus?
Oh, he is complicated, isn't he?
How did you approach doing Odysseus?
Well, I mean, I've always told audiences that the most dangerous place in Greek myth for a man is anywhere near Odysseus. For a woman, it's marrying Theseus, because he's a serial killer of women. For a man, it's anywhere near Odysseus, because, as you'll know, spoiler, if you read the Odyssey, the only Ithacan who gets back from the Trojan War is Odysseus. Literally, sometimes they fall off a roof and he doesn't notice. Sometimes, they eat the sun's cows and then the sun gets angry with them. Sometimes they get swallowed by a whirlpool. And generally, it's an incredibly dangerous place to be. And so I really wanted to write him kind of sexy but slightly hapless. He has good ideas, but he doesn't think through all the consequences. And I've always loved those reunion scenes in the last, we always forget that he gets home like 8 books before the end of the Odyssey. And then there's a lot of time with him and Penelope kind of not finding each other, not speaking to each other, a lot of things which are very opaque, and we don't know who knows what and when. And so it is a really sort of strange way for the poem to go. But it had always seemed to me, from all the other stories outside of Homer that we have about Odysseus and Penelope, that they must be really well matched, because when he turns up, he's one of the suitors who turns up to woo Helen before she marries Menelaus. And every, Greek tribal leader turns up to try and marry Helen because she's the most beautiful woman in the world. And Odysseus sees her cousin Penelope, and he thinks, you know what, I'd like to marry her instead. And I thought, what kind of man sees the most beautiful woman in the world and then sees her cousin standing behind her and thinks, actually, I prefer her? And what kind of woman stands up to that kind of male gaze and isn't found wanting? And I thought, she must be incredible. And so I decided, really, my original goal with this book, I'm not sure if I've ever told you this, was that I would do the Odyssey the same way that I did the Iliad. So you would get the whole of the story of Odysseus told from the perspectives of all the women he meets. And I thought that would be really fun, because then I can do Circe and Calypso and, Nausicaa and Scylla and Charybdis. And I'm like, how am I going to do the voice of a whirlpool? I'm like, let's not go there. We'll get. And then when I wrote the first letter from Penelope, I loved her so much. I just couldn't stop. And I thought, no, I'm going to have her tell his whole story that way, so that she's hearing it from, because another theme that runs through the Odyssey is bards performing and performing the story of Odysseus. Sometimes it is Odysseus in disguise, sometimes he's pretending not to be him. The first time we meet Penelope in book 1 of the Odyssey, she cries because a bard is singing about how difficult it is for the Greeks to get home. She's like, do you know a happy song? Have you got anything good? Do you know anything a bit nicer? How about 3 Chords and the Truth? And I thought it would just be fun to do her story in a slightly more central way, and for us to see Odysseus through her eyes. And so I thought, she's going to be really smart, because he's really smart. He fucks things up, but he's really smart. And so generally what you get is she gets less fond of him as the poem goes on, because obviously he's gone for longer and longer, and his dalliances become more and more hard to ignore. And my version, which is a version also stolen from some later ancient Greek sources, my Penelope has a little bit of a crush on one of the suitors. She's not quite as pristine as Homer's Penelope. And I was like, oh no, it's in Pseudo Apollodorus, I'll give her a go. And I thought, gosh, they should match. They should match as a couple. And so I wanted to tell his story. So when she tells the story of him blinding the Cyclops, she's really impressed with him. But she'd have been just a tiny bit more impressed if he kept his big, stupid mouth shut and not said who he was and earned the wrath of Poseidon, which will delay him for years more. She's so impressed with him for all these things. And she's like, could you have just done this? Could you then? And it was just too satisfying to write. I just loved her.
But the thing about Penelope in your book is that you do the story of the weaving and the unweaving every night. And texteri, the same word that we get for weaving and for text, it's like she's the other person who's rewriting the story. She's the one who's saying, well, look, okay, you've all heard the bards sing about what Odysseus did, but I'm going to unweave that story.
And
was that a conscious pun that you put into the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those themes that runs through ancient sources that, again, we often don't notice, brutally, because they are about women, and many classicists for the last 200 years have not been very interested in women. And so actually textiles and weaving are a theme for loads of these women. So obviously Penelope with the weaving and unweaving, that story is told 3 separate times in the Odyssey. And the last time it's told from the underworld by one of the suitors that Odysseus has killed. She weaves the shroud, as she says, she's making for her not yet dead father-in-law. It's not offensive in the ancient world. It's respectful to prepare for someone dying. It's not like, hurry up and die, old man. And she weaves the shroud, and it takes her, the suitors are so thick, it takes her 3 years. And then she gets grassed up by one of her slave women. They still don't realize. Like, how long do you think it takes to make a shirt? No wonder she doesn't want to have sex with them. They're all idiots. But I thought, it's a part of her story I've never ever heard told, and you'll be able to hear me talk about Penelope at greater length on Radio 4 on Sunday. So I should stop now, otherwise you'll be bored then. But I, as a keen knitter and generally person who makes things, the thing is that when you unravel knitting, every stitch locks into the previous stitch, so you just pull on it and it unravels really fast. Whereas weaving, you have to literally physically unmake every single row. It takes precisely as long as it took to make it, except you've got the psychological trauma of it getting smaller, not bigger, and you're doing it in the fucking dark. So it's just that she condemns herself to this horrific kind of Sisyphean task in order to stay single, in order to stay married to Odysseus when everybody thinks he's dead. And that seemed to me like such a noble and heroic act. It's just incredible that it doesn't get bigged up more. And to be fair, at the end of the Odyssey, Agamemnon says, "Oh, the gods will create a beautiful poem about Penelope because she's so clever." But he immediately turns it back on his own wife and says, "Unlike my wife, no, 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 no." And the weaving theme runs all the way through. In the Iliad, Helen is weaving a tapestry which literally, Homer says, tells the story of the war. So within the world of the Iliad, Helen is Homer, right? She is the one telling the war narrative. It's just she's
Very
doing
good.
she's doing it visually rather than orally, and that's okay. And then, of course, famously in the Agamemnon, the first play of the Oresteia by Aeschylus, Clytemnestra weaves a snare or trap for Agamemnon. He is a king, a warrior king coming home from a war, and she intends to kill him as punishment for him having killed their daughter. And so she weaves, we can see it on the incredible pot that I think is held in Boston, but I'll find a link for, well, I say that I've already found the link for it, I just don't have it to hand. But it's like a thin, gauzy garment, and it's like a mourning robe in ancient Greece. So it's super fine fabric. We can see his naked body through the fabric, and he's got his arms in it, and it looks like there are sleeves, but it's like a straitjacket. They're sewn up at the ends, and so he's reaching out, but he can't possibly pick up a sword or anything. He's trapped inside this thing, and that's part of the Clytemnestra story. She weaves this extraordinary garment which will incapacitate her warrior husband to even the odds between them, and of course she kills him either with an axe or a sword. So weaving is this sort of ultimate virtuous pursuit for women in the Bronze Age. It'll carry on being the ultimate virtuous pursuit for upper class women right the way through imperial Rome, so for another good couple of 1,000 years. And yet here are 3 different women weaving in ways which makes us realize it's a completely morally neutral thing that can be done in different ways. So Penelope uses it deceitfully to try and stay true to her husband, which is the perfect metaphor for the two of them, honest and dishonest at the same time. Clytemnestra weaves deceitfully in order to kill her husband, and Helen weaves her version of a narrative for us to read. So these women are all using female crafts in a really different way each, and God, those stories should have been told. I really mean this. These stories should have been being told for hundreds of years. I don't understand why it took this long.
Tell me, in terms of the relationship to Homer's own text, when I read the book, I noticed that you used quite a lot of words like soot covered or blood-stained. Yeah. And it seemed to be very much like Homer and, the wine dark sea.
Yes.
Was it to give it a Homeric feel? I mean, soot and blood.
So. I have to tell you that colour is incredibly hard to do. When you're writing about the Bronze Age, colour is one, I know this sounds really but it's one of the hardest things to do, because loads of things by which we might know colour don't exist yet. So, for example, fruit that we might say, this is lemon yellow, or this is apricot color, they don't exist. You have to make the choice to go ahistorical, or you have to find another way around it. So just finding things that you can compare things to is really hard. But I cannot lie to you, Stuart. I would like very much to have been able to do more with colour in the ancient world than I could. And it felt like a step too far, because as I'm sure you know, people saw colour differently in the ancient world. and particularly in the Bronze Age and when Homer is writing in the 8th, 7th century BCE. So when the phrase we translate as wine dark, we're kind of mistranslating it, and people in the ancient world didn't see colour in the way that we see it. They saw sparkliness. So when Homer says so the sea is like wine, the comparative point isn't the shade. You know, generations of school children are sat there going, the sea is not the same colour as wine. Wine's red or white. What are you talking about? The sea is blue. Here's the thing. It's not the colour, the shade that he's comparing it to. It's the way that when you pour wine, the light glints off it that's relevant. And that's like the sea. And if I could have found a way to convey that complexity of language and thought having changed, I would be feeling extremely proud of myself right now. But I couldn't. And in the end, I had to just go back to colour. But you're right, there's a little hat tip to Homer with some of those epithet constructions. But mainly it's just because writing about colour is so fucking hard when you're writing about nature.
Well, you do it very well in terms of skies.
Thank you.
In the book. The skies are always kind of shown to be, in some ways, both distant and close, particularly in the Creusa chapter.
Yes.
Where she thinks, oh, hang on, is it actually sunshine? No, my whole city's on fire.
Yeah. Well, she was another woman who really deserved reclaiming, because obviously I had Iliad 2, which is the story of the fall of Troy, as my GCSE text, and
I had 4.
I had 4 for A level. I mean, just the best by far. But I loved to, and yet even as a teenager, even at 16, I'm like, wait, so this hero guy gets his kid and his ancient can't be bothered to hurry the fuck up dad and leaves the city, and his missus is somewhere behind him, and then he just doesn't notice she's gone, and then he's like, oh, she's gone, and then she reappears as a ghost and basically goes, oh, hi, go on, have fun, meet someone new. No, I'm writing a version who's not going to be. She's just like, oh, bye, and then dies. No, that's not going to happen. Not a much. So she gets a really long chapter because I'm like, Creusa gets justice now, and she's still not blamey, but she gets to. Yeah, she deserves. And it's like she just disappears, and you don't know what's happened to her. And I thought, how many narratives are we used to seeing in film, in particular, but also in books and on telly, where a woman is, she's just the wife of some guy and he has an adventure, and then we just stop caring about her. And I'm like, well, what if we focus on her and we just don't notice what happens to him? And I thought, well, I can never resist these things once I've thought of them. I'm so childish.
There was one character that when I was reading the book, I kept on thinking, what's she going to do with this one? And it's Cressida. Why was Cressida not in it?
Cressida is in it. Cressida is a retelling of Chryseis, and she's Briseis and Chryseis in chapter whatever it is, 4 or 5.
But Troilus, the whole Troilus Cressida, I mean, it's one of the most objectionable. Yeah, but it's one of the most
Shakespeare isn't interesting for me. Shakespeare isn't really interesting for me because he's too late for my sources. So Chryseis isn't called Cressida until really, really late. It's medieval times, I think. So she was always going to be Chryseis for me. And the story of Troilus is, this is what happens. This is what happens with women and their narratives. Is we're not interested in them unless we can make them a love match with somebody. And you go, no. What if that weren't so? What if that didn't happen? What if Chryseis is just there as the daughter of Chryses? What if she's there as the war bride of Agamemnon? What if she's there as somebody whose importance is enough to start a plague, rained down on them by the god Apollo? What if that? So yeah, Troilus doesn't get airtime from me. He's had his go. He's been performed millions of times. Thanks very much, Shakespeare. Chryseis all the way, and not Cressida, which is a poncy name anyway.
Dunbar did a fairly good, not Dunbar, Henryson did a fairly good version of it, where he kind of redeems her from the misogyny of Chaucer. But one question, then we'll go and try and get some questions from the people that are watching at home. Apollo is completely central to your book. And he's a monster.
Yes.
Explain. What is, if I think of Apollo, I think of the Apollo Belvedere, and I think of, this beautiful...
It's a beautiful one, yeah. He is beautiful, to be fair, in my version. He is. all the gods and goddesses are psychopathic in mine. And as I'm sure you realised, I stole that from Euripides.
Yes.
So in Euripides' Hippolytus, which is a play which has nothing to do with the Trojan War, it begins with Aphrodite walking on stage and saying, I really like people who pay me lots of honour, and I really dislike people who don't pay me any honour. And one of those people is Hippolytus, and I'm about to destroy him. And I'm going to destroy him and his stepmother, who's paid me loads of honour. And you're like, wait, didn't you just say that you would be? No, not a bit of it. She could not give a crap about anything. And she just destroys this entire family across the play because a young man isn't interested in having sex. And she's personally insulted by that. And so she destroys the family, takes his life, takes Phaedra's life. And then at the end, we'd like to think that people had, that she is a uniquely terrible goddess. At the end, Artemis, who is her sort of opposite, and Hippolytus is Artemis's favourite, Artemis comes on and goes, well, she destroyed one of my favourites, so I'm going to destroy one of hers. And you're like, oh my God, no one's learned anything. And so, yeah, all the goddesses and gods in my narrative are exactly as monstrous as those two. They all have precisely no moral compass and just their pure id. They are exactly like malevolent lifelong toddlers. They can just, everything they want, they just grab at, irrespective of the consequences. And Apollo is that. When Chryseis' dad prays to Apollo in book 1 of the Iliad and says, rain down plague on them, they've taken my daughter. He goes, yeah, fine. Now one guy has taken his daughter. One guy, one guy. And yet the Greeks drop like flies because Apollo's angry and he just feels like it, huh? And his destruction of Cassandra, I still think it's one of the most vicious punishments in all of Greek myth. He tries to rape her, and she makes him a deal. Essentially, she says, give me the gift of prophecy and then you can have sex with me. And he says, here's the gift of prophecy. And she goes, oh, I don't want to have sex with you. And he punishes her by making her see the future but be unbelieved. So it is the same as she is totally sane, but everyone thinks she is mad. And it is the most horrific punishment. There's isolation of it. And as I'm sure you know, I love Cassandra the way I have written her. I love her. And so, yeah, he is an absolute monster. But that is the monstrous behavior of men and gods is not unusual, unfortunately. So, yes, he is still beautiful, but he is sort of icy and a bit chilly. And I think that when I see the Belvedere Apollo, that's what I see. I think this is an issue of who you relate yourself to. There's an incredibly beautiful vase in the Metropolitan Museum in New York of Medusa, who is a beautiful girl, not a monster, a beautiful girl, being decapitated by Perseus when she's asleep, and robbed of all the monstrosity, which is caused by Athene, by the way. She's just a beautiful woman asleep, being beheaded, and it's really harrowing. And yet, downstairs in the main hall, you can see a statue called Perseus Triumphant, and it's Perseus looking very beautiful, holding her head aloft. And it's like, well, he's only triumphant if you associate yourself with Perseus. If you associate yourself with Medusa and you've got slightly shit hair today, then frankly, it looks a little bit unpleasant. So, yeah, I think it's all about who we associate ourselves with. I don't ever feel close to Apollo, and so I found it very easy to not find him beautiful. I found him cold and cruel.
I would agree, and I always found it. I mean, you know that I'm more of a Hebraist than a Hellenist. I always found that very strange that the Hellenic gods were so cold, but then I associate them with statues that ought to be painted. Let's take a couple of questions. Matthew's asking, did you change Homer's story in writing this? And if you did, whose version did you replace it with? Well, it's not all Homer, is it?
It certainly isn't. And Homer isn't the originator of Homer's story either. Homer is a retelling, even the version that we know. So the stories of the Trojan War emanate all across Greece around about the same time. That's why we have so many contradictory stories. There isn't a kind of right version of these myths. That's why sometimes, for example, Achilles is killed by Paris, sometimes he's killed by Apollo, sometimes Penthesilea appears and kills, and different, and there are countless different narratives. Sometimes Odysseus dies one way, sometimes he dies another. Sometimes Penelope remains faithful to him, sometimes she doesn't. Sometimes he kills her, sometimes she marries somebody, and so on and so on. There are all these different contradictory narratives, and the reason is these stories were bubbling up all over Greece for a really long time, and so you end up with different kind of regional variations where one version is preferred to another. There are versions of the Agamemnon story where Clytemnestra kills him while her lover Aegisthus watches, and there are many, many more versions where Aegisthus kills and Clytemnestra is the cheerleader. But the most famous version that we have in Agamemnon, she's the killer, and so there is no right version to change. There are just lots of different versions. And yes, when I looked at Homer, sometimes I wanted that version of, but I mean, for example, Homer's version of Penelope is incredibly opaque. It's really hard to know what she thinks or feels, and often when she says something, it's because a goddess has put the idea into her mind. It's like, well, is that her view or Athena's view? But we get a very different and more complicated version of her in, say, Ovid in Herodes' letter number 1. We get 3 completely contradictory versions of Helen in 3 different Euripides plays, and the 2 versions in both texts which we ascribe to Homer contradict each other as well. So all I basically did was pick versions that I found interesting or fill in gaps where the gaps existed. There is no source about Eris, the goddess of strife.
Who is wonderful in your book.
Thank you. I loved writing her. She's so thick, and it was just so much fun to write someone who's really malevolent and quite stupid at the same time. But there was just a huge gap there, which I could cheerfully fill in. My version of Hecate, the stories of Homer just don't go as far as, because of when they stop, they don't go as far as to tell us the story of Hecate, which is in a Euripides play, and that is one of the most horrific revenges in all of Greek tragedy. I was never going to miss that out. I just love it. So yeah, I picked them from all kinds of places as the short answer. Everyone from, yes, Homer, to Euripides, lots of Euripides, Ovid often, Pseudo-Apollodorus, Quintus Memmius. I mean, some of them are on vase paintings. The earrings that Thetis gets on her wedding day are in the British Museum. So yeah, there's a lot of, this is based on visual sources and literary sources from the ancient world, and virtually, I think, nothing beyond about 300 CE. After that, I lose interest. But yes.
I always loved the bonkers story about, was it Stesichorus?
Who composes 2 versions of the Helen story.
Yes, and is struck blind because in the first one she's vilified.
Yes, and then he doesn't have to one.
Yeah.
Suddenly gets his eyesight back.
I just love that about myth, the fact that you can actually tell more than one version of any myth, which means it's not like Game of Thrones. So a question from Lucy. About the Gaia section of the book. Does that come from an ancient source?
It does. The idea that there's too many people in the world. Yeah, I think it must be the earliest story about overpopulation, the earliest kind of myth about overpopulation from anywhere in the world, I think. Yeah, so yes, it does.
And is it, which text is it in? Is it in Hesiod or is it?
I think it might be Hesiod, yeah, or Theognis or somebody. Yeah, I'm afraid I've forgotten now because I'm 1 book further on and 2 years too late.
It's a great chapter. Yeah, it's a great chapter, that, because you do.
I was very sad when I wrote that one. Yeah.
Sorry?
I was quite sad when I wrote that one, I think. I felt very kind of, people always think there's too many people. But yeah, in theory, there's this idea that there's too many men in the world. And so the Theban Wars happen, which is the story we know Oedipus from, but there's a big civil war after Oedipus dies. And that keeps the numbers down for a bit, and then we breed too much and we get too heavy for Gaia to hold us, and so the Trojan War happens to bring the numbers down again. So yeah, no, it's an ancient story. I know it sounds really modern, and this is the perfect illustration of what we're saying about how things have modern resonances. I'm sure there must be people reading that going, oh, I see, Haynes has put a bit of contemporary population anxiety into it. It's like, I didn't, I promise, I admit I chose it, but I didn't invent it.
I just read, and you'll remember the times when we were reading all the books together for the Booker Prize, the new Lauren Bucas novel.
Love her.
Yeah, well, it's about the fact that there's a virus which kills off 99% of all men in the world.
Oh, great timing.
And what happens afterwards. Yeah. Good timing. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously written beforehand.
Yeah.
But
I'm admiring
it's
her
always
marketing strategy. I'm going to call it audacious.
well, it's always the thing about it's the men that ought to be killed off, and the women who persist.
Interesting.
They're the survivors.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, I can't wait to read
People
it.
with my kind of awful chromosomes are, frankly, weaklings.
I'm sorry to let you know, yeah. I'm sorry this is how it's worked. I'm sorry this is how you found out. Yeah, no, I can't wait to read it. You know I love her, so yes, good.
Well, I hope she's actually put forward for the Booker. It's a really good novel, but then we just don't know what's going to happen this year.
We just don't know.
Adrian, can we get another question through? Have you got questions coming up on your screen?
Yes, I do. Dr. Peter.
Yeah.
Isn't there a belief that the word for blue didn't arrive till modern times? Hence him calling it wine dark. Yeah, like I say, I have no idea when the word blue appears because I genuinely don't know anything when the Romans leave Britain after that until about 20 minutes ago. I don't know any history. For me, as Stuart genuinely knows, the Hilary Mantel books are a thriller because I genuinely don't know what's going to happen in them. So I can't tell you when blue arrived or indeed when modern times begin. But yeah, as I said before, the idea of the sea being wine dark, it's not about the colour, it's a mistranslation. It's a sensible mistranslation, it's one that saves time, but it's about how we see colour. People just saw colour differently in the ancient world. So they differentiated it according to how glittery it was rather than its shade. I know that we think everyone has always seen colour the way that we do. Of course, that's not the case. There are people who have names for colours that we don't have in the world now. And it's certainly true that people didn't always see things in the same way.
I mean, the word glass was always used as in Welsh to mean sea-like, and it could refer to everything from green to blue to grey.
Right, because the colour isn't what's important; it's the translucence of it, maybe. Or
yeah.
It's once you start thinking about things that we don't. I would use the same word to describe something opaque and blue, and transparent and blue, and translucent and blue. I would say it's blue, but you can easily see why somebody might think those were three different categories of things, and that the fact that they were to us the same colour wasn't important. So
yes, the Russians have two different words for blue, and they see them completely differently.
Right, and you have that
cyan and navy.
Even if we're using the same word for the same colours, we might not see the same thing. We would mean totally different things as we use the same word and assume that we saw the world in the same way. But why would we? Do you want me to read you more questions?
I've got some through here at the moment. This is a really good one. What do you make of the theory that Homer was actually a woman?
It's Samuel Butler's, isn't it? And he thought the Odyssey had been written by a woman because there were so many good female characters in it. I can only assume he's been reading modern novels by men, Stuart. I don't know what could possibly give him that idea otherwise. Women, the same thing as people. It must be a woman writing it. What else could it possibly be? There is absolutely no evidence for any women working as rhapsodes in the time that Homer was, or the predecessors of Homer were performing. We just have literally not a single. I know it's very hard to argue from a lack of evidence, but we don't have any evidence of any women ever doing it. We don't have evidence of women, performing any kind of epic poetry. Our earliest is lyric poetry, and it's Sappho. So yeah, I would love the author of the Odyssey to have been a woman, but I think it's pretty unlikely.
Yes, I mean the Butler thing is very, very strange, and the way it was picked up and actually made a kind of valorization. But here we go. The cold, cruel beauty of the gods and perhaps portrayals of Helen don't seem to fit with the idea of Kalos Kagathos. Or do you think the standards for gods and mythical characters are different for classical poets?
So it depends what you mean by classical and indeed what you mean by poet. But I would argue that the gods, Euripides is mocked in his own lifetime by Aristophanes for the way he portrays the gods. And we're told he was prosecuted for impiety, Asabeia, for the way that he portrayed the gods. So it was obviously shocking, or it seems that it was shocking to his audience in 5th century BC Athens. But it certainly isn't anachronistic to say that making the gods monstrous rather than delightful, that's something which belongs in the ancient world just as much as now. So long as we remember that Euripides exists, he's the source of the majority of the plays that we still have about the Trojan War. And so, yeah, I think the idea of being good and fine, as people tend to translate kalos kagathos, or beautiful and good, it's a nice thought, but we certainly don't get that version of the gods anywhere in Euripides. In the Bacchae, look at Dionysus; he is absolutely vicious. So yeah, I guess there are certainly nicer versions of the gods. You know, the worldview that Euripides has, as I say, was treated as being quite dangerous and risky in his lifetime. But I feel completely fine taking that through to the present.
Let's go to one other one here. I'm sorry I'm such a dunce with this technology. Would you consider your book a good introduction to the story of Troy, or should you start with Homer?
I guess it depends what you're looking for. Homer, in every regard, is magnificent and wonderful, and I would love you to read him. He's also difficult sometimes. There are, 48 books, I guess, 24 for the Iliad, 24 for the Odyssey. So if you wanted something which will tell you the story of the war pretty much in its entirety, from beginning to duration to aftermath, then I guess I don't think a novel is necessarily the best introduction to a subject, necessarily. But yes, I think it would probably do it for you. You'd probably end up thinking, there aren't very many men in this war. But yeah, I think I would hope that people would read. You know what? Read mine, and if you like it, read Homer, or read Homer, and if you like him, read mine. I don't mind which way you do it, but I hope that you read them both.
Excellent. Now, have you read the book Gods Behaving Badly by Marie Phillips?
No, and I know her, so I feel really guilty that I haven't.
Well, I mean, there have been various versions of the gods in contemporary
Yeah, because they don't die and they make it to now.
Yeah.
Simon Armitage did it, didn't he? And I can't remember whether it was his Odyssey or... Yeah, it was in his Fall of Troy.
His version of the Odyssey, yeah. And Neil Gaiman did it,
right.
Although we're not allowed to talk about him at the moment. There's been lots of people who have done variations on the gods. Is that because they're archetypes or because they're just good stories?
I think. I mean, there's no way around it. Greek myth has a lot more archetypal resonance for us, I would say, than, for example, Norse myth. I think most of us don't think very often about the idea of there being a big tree and, a snake and a thing and a thing and a thing, and someone devours a thing. It all feels a bit separate from us. There's a reason why you have to kind of go to Valhalla. It feels like it's somewhere else. Whereas there is a reason why Freud found his way of talking about ourselves, or at least talking about men, because obviously women are some other weird subspecies as far as Freud is concerned. And it's because I think, they are archetypes, both the stories of gods in Greek myth and sometimes the story of people in Greek myth. The idea that children seek to overthrow the parent of the same sex and have a kind of patterning onto the parent of the opposite sex seems to me it's pretty true, isn't it? And so yes, I think these stories are archetypal in lots of ways. And in other ways they're completely bonkers and really separate from us. The joy of Greek myth is that it's incredibly nuanced and broad and deep and complex, and so it's essentially what you want from it you'll find in it. That doesn't mean that's what it is or what it's for, but it's there for you if you'd like it. That's what I always try and tell people who it's one of my great bugbears, as you know, Stuart, that not very many people get to study classics at school, and generally there's a divide along wealth. That classics tends to be taught in schools which rich children go to, and I think classics belongs to everybody. And so I quite often get people getting in touch with me to say they weren't allowed to do classics at school because they failed their 11 plus, and now they've retired, and what should they start with? And I feel very strongly that classics will wait for as long as you need it to. Classics is just, it's there for you. If the only thing you ever experience from the ancient world is, Ray Harryhausen's Jason and the Argonauts, that's fine. Then you had a lovely bank holiday Monday, and I'm fine with that. If you end up, embarking on Homer, I had a woman who started studying Latin when she retired, and then she did her PhD in Greek in her 80s. And it's like, if you can wait that long, Greek will wait for you. You know, it's waited a really long time, so don't worry.
Indeed, I can sympathise completely. The only reason I was allowed to do Greek was I said I refused to do PE, the physical education.
I believe that, Stuart. I
Yes.
believe it.
But it seemed to me perfectly logical that Greek was going to be more important in the rest of my life than the high jump or something.
I picked Greek instead of German, which I've never been sorry for, even when, as a comedian, I gigged Berlin. When it's slightly awkward, but nonetheless, there it is. I'm still not sorry.
Can we take another couple of questions? If you have them.
I have 2 more minutes, for what it's worth.
If you have 2 quick answers, that'd be super.
Yes. Right. How much did I work with translations to write the book? Which ones did I use? How much of your own translation did you do? Yes, when I'm looking for a whole story, I use translations a lot. When I go in for a specific bit of the story, I translate it myself from the Greek or the Latin, is the answer. And that's even more noticeable in the next book I've written, Pandora's Jar, is non-fiction, and then all the translations are my own. So yeah, if I need to hunt a random passage of like Odyssey 6 out, obviously I'll use a translation of the Odyssey, usually the Emily Wilson, because it's terrific. I've got, I think, 3 different translations of the Iliad lurking around. I have no idea how I pick them. Sometimes I've just owned them for a really long time. Sometimes I've replaced them. I think I've got 2 or 3 different versions of Medea, but I only ever use the Greek because that was my I wrote my dissertation on Medea, so I know it really well. So the answer is there is no system at all, and I'm really sorry. Oh, another question.
One other question.
Oh, Greek men. The reason was Homer. Oh, wait. The reason for what is? Oh, Homer evidently knew nothing about how ships were made. Greek men of the time, it's said, would have known all about shipbuilding. Well, that's asking a lot of Greek men of the time, isn't it? I mean, I know that the Greeks, according to Plato, who's writing the 4th century BCE, and Homer's the 8th century or 7th century BCE, so a few hundred years later. Plato says the Greeks all live like frogs around a pond because they all live on islands or on coastal areas. But that's not true for the Thebans. The Thebans don't live very near a coast. They live in central Boeotia. So yes, I suppose they might have known something about shipbuilding, but we're assuming that everyone is equally receptive to all kinds of knowledge and equally practical. And I have no reason to believe that would be true of men in the past any more than it is true of all of us now. Some of us are going to be just more prone to know things than others. And I think Homer is creating a narrative. The accuracy of shipbuilding is maybe not his priority. I'm sorry, person who probably builds ships. I think building ships is a noble and excellent thing to do, but I'm not certain it was Homer's primary goal.
My shipbuilding skills are not the greatest.
Mine are chronic. And you know me, I can knit, so I can make you a fishing net, but I can't build you a ship. I can barely ride a bike. I've got other skills, so it's fine. But one of those other skills is kickboxing, which I'm afraid I've got to go and do in precisely 1 minute. Sensei Aaron is waiting for me.
Please buy the book through the Wigtown bookshop. Please
yes,
support
please do.
the
It looks
festival.
Like this in blue.
At this
Look at
point.
That.
That's a much better cover. I was using the proof. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much.
Please join me. Actually, give a clap to Natalie Haynes.
Thank you. I'm sorry I can't stay anymore. I have to go, or Sensei Aaron will make me do punishment push-ups. So I'll see you again.